The night my brother got a Rolex, I smiled and nodded, pretending I had not just become an empty chair at the table. The watch was not why I left. It was my father proving he knew exactly how to value a child. Just never me. 19 months later, when an old debt needed a cleaner, he finally called. I am not returning to beg to be seen. I am going back to force them to look. My name is Mia Moore. I am 32 years old, and I am sitting in the exact center of Marlowe House, a restaurant in the wealthiest district of Charlotte, where the lighting is intentionally dim and the menus are heavy enough to feel like binding legal documents. The crystal water glasses catch the ambient light, throwing sharp little prisms across the thick white linen tablecloth. We are supposed to be celebrating a joint graduation. That was the explicit invitation sent out 2 weeks ago. But as the evening progresses, with every expensive bottle of red wine uncorked and every story told, it becomes glaringly obvious that the only person actually in the room is my older brother, Owen Moore. Owen is 36 years old. He has just earned his Master of Business Administration from a prestigious private university, the kind of ivy-draped institution that charges tuition high enough to buy a small house in the suburbs. He wears a tailored charcoal suit that fits his broad shoulders perfectly. Leaning back in his imported leather chair with the relaxed, effortless confidence of a man who knows the world was built for his personal convenience. I finished my bachelor degree in data accounting exactly 4 months ago. My degree came from a massive, underfunded state college. It was forged in the ugly, buzzing, fluorescent glare of late-night classes, fueled by bitter gas station coffee and the relentless exhaustion of working a full-time corporate job during the day. Nobody asks about my final exams. Nobody asks how I managed to balance 50-hour work weeks with advanced spreadsheet modeling and tax law. Tonight is solely about Owen and his magnificent achievements. My father, Daniel Moore, taps his silver fork against his crystal wine glass. The sharp, high chime cuts through the low hum of restaurant chatter, demanding absolute silence from our table. He stands up, adjusting his dark silk tie, his chest puffed out with a pride so thick it feels suffocating to breathe in. He begins a speech that he has clearly rehearsed for days in front of a mirror. He does not use notes. He speaks of grand vision. He speaks of natural leadership. He uses the phrase a great future awaiting a truly great mind. He looks at Owen not as a son, but as a corporate heir apparent. He talks about the noble legacy of hard work, a deeply ironic choice of words considering my brother has never had to pay his own rent or struggle with a past due utility bill. My father drops his voice an octave, thick with manufactured emotion, acting as if he is not merely giving a dinner toast, but actively passing down a royal crown to his rightful successor. Then comes the grand finale. My father reaches into the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket and pulls out a heavy dark green velvet box. He places it on the table in front of Owen with the hushed reverence of a priest placing a sacred offering on an altar. Owen opens it. The golden hinge makes a soft, expensive snap that echoes loudly in my ears. Resting inside on a pale suede cushion is a Rolex. The polished steel and gold catch the low restaurant light, gleaming with a vulgar, undeniable brilliance. The table erupts in applause. My mother, Elaine, brings a perfectly manicured hand to her mouth, her eyes welling with proud, happy tears. Cell phones are instantly drawn like weapons, camera flashes blinding me as they capture every single angle of Owen slipping the heavy luxury timepiece onto his left wrist. I sit there, perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I am not jealous of the watch. A heavy piece of jewelry means absolutely nothing to me. The cold, heavy stone sitting in the pit of my stomach is carved from something else entirely. It is the undeniable, physical proof of my father's capacity to care. He planned this moment down to the second. He researched the specific watch, made the expensive purchase, hid the box, and carefully wrote a moving speech. He knows exactly how to make a child feel like the center of the universe, how to validate their existence with loud, public pride. He simply chose never to do it for me. When I graduated 4 months ago, there was no green velvet box, there was no moving speech, there was only a rushed lunch at a loud, generic chain restaurant near the highway. My father spent 20 minutes complaining about the heavy traffic on Interstate 77, constantly checking his own plain watch as if my minor celebration was delaying his actual important life. My mother handed me a store-bought card with a pre-printed message and a $20 bill tucked inside. We were finished eating and out the door in exactly 45 minutes. The applause at Marlowe House finally dies down. Owen is admiring his wrist, rotating it back and forth to catch the overhead light. A boy king playing with his new toy. The silence that follows is thick with cloying self-satisfaction. And then, a voice cuts through the honeyed atmosphere. It is Aunt Judith Sloan, my father's younger sister. She is the only person in our entire extended family who does not play by the unspoken, suffocating rules of the Moore household. She takes a slow, deliberate sip of her red wine, sets the crystal glass down, and looks directly at my father. She asks, casually, her voice ringing clear across the table, "What about Mia? She just graduated too, right?" The temperature at the table drops 10 degrees. The air immediately leaves the room. Every eye shifts to my father, waiting to see how the master architect of our family dynamics will handle this unexpected structural flaw. Daniel Moore does not miss a single beat. He turns his head slightly in my direction. He offers a faint, tight-lipped smile that does not reach his eyes. He gives me a single, brief nod, the exact kind of dismissive nod a wealthy patron gives a waiter who has successfully refilled a water glass. Then, without taking a single breath, he turns his body entirely away from me. He flags down a passing waiter. He asks to see the dessert menu and inquires if they have any decaffeinated coffee left in the back. In the span of 5 short seconds, he shifts the conversation from my entire existence to the availability of decaf. He snuffs out my life, my exhausting struggles, and my academic achievements with one seamless, brutal subject change. I do not scream. I do not throw my water glass across the room. I do exactly what I've been rigorously trained to do for 32 years. I swallow it. I sit at that table for another 50 minutes. I watch them order chocolate fondant and vanilla bean creme brulee. I watch them laugh at jokes I am not a part of. I count the agonizing minutes. I count the silent ticking of the second hand on Owen's new watch, though I cannot hear it over the sound of my own heartbeat pounding fiercely in my ears. In those 50 minutes, the final, pathetic illusion of my childhood completely shatters. I realize that I was never accidentally forgotten. Forgetting implies a mistake. Forgetting implies an oversight that can be corrected. I was not overlooked. I was placed. I was carefully, deliberately placed into the exact invisible corner they built for me. I am the background noise. I am the easy, low-maintenance child who demands nothing and receives exactly that in return. The extravagant bill is finally paid, slipped into a leather folder by my father without a second glance. Wooden chairs scrape against the polished hardwood floor as we all stand up. We walk out into the cool Carolina night air, the humidity of the southern evening clinging to my skin. The valet brings around my father's pristine luxury sedan. I turn to my mother and wrap my arms around her shoulders, offering a standard, practiced hug. She smells of expensive floral perfume and deep complacency. I look at Owen, smile a perfectly measured smile, and tell him congratulations one last time. My voice does not shake. My hands do not tremble. I turn on my heel and walk toward my own tired, 10-year-old sedan parked out of sight in the distant self-park lot. The gravel crunches softly under my heels, a steady, grounding rhythm. I do not look back at the warm, golden glow of the restaurant. I get into my car, close the heavy metal door, and put the key in the ignition. That was the exact night I left my family. They were too busy admiring the shining time on Owen's wrist to realize my time with them had just completely run out. They did not know it yet as they drove away in the opposite direction, but I was never going back. Growing up in the manicured, sprawling suburbs of Charlotte, being 4 years younger than Owen meant vastly more than just a simple age gap. In the Moore household, birth order was a rigid, unspoken caste system. The labels were handed out early and they stuck to our skin like hot tar. Owen was undeniably the one with limitless potential. I was consistently labeled as the one who could always take care of herself. It sounds like a genuine compliment when you say it out loud. It is not a compliment. It is a psychological hall pass. It was a highly convenient, completely guilt-free license for my parents to clock out of the exhausting work of raising me while maintaining the polished facade of a perfect suburban family. You can accurately measure a child's worth in a house by the sheer square footage they are allotted. Owen occupied the master bedroom adjacent suite at the end of the second-floor hallway. It featured a deep walk-in closet and a custom-built window seat overlooking the quiet cul-de-sac. The justification for this spatial monopoly was always framed as pure practicality. "He is in high school," my mother would say, meticulously smoothing invisible wrinkles from her linen apron. "He has a very demanding schedule. He needs the extra space to study and grow into a young man." I lived in the room directly at the top of the stairs, a space barely larger than a standard utility closet. I waited my turn. I waited patiently for 4 entire years. But when I finally entered my freshman year of high school, and Owen left our home to pursue his undergraduate degree, the big room did not magically become mine. His vintage sports posters stayed firmly taped to the walls. His debating trophies remained perfectly aligned on the floating shelves. When I politely asked my father if I could finally move my clothes and books down the hall to the larger room, he did not even bother to look up from the morning newspaper he was reading. "Owen will still be coming home to visit on the holidays," he said, his tone sharply suggesting that I was being incredibly selfish and unreasonable. I spent my 4 years of high school cramming my legs under a tiny particle board desk, suffocating in a cramped box while a vastly superior space sat completely empty for 10 months out of every single year. The financial disparities between us were never delivered as a single crushing blow. They were executed as a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 tiny paper cuts. When Owen entered his junior year, my father opened his leather checkbook wide and never seemed to close it. There were expensive weekend leadership retreats in the mountains, private standardized test tutoring sessions that cost hundreds of dollars an hour, and elite college application consultants hired to polish his essays. When Owen failed his driving test on his very first try because he recklessly reversed a vehicle directly into a bright orange traffic cone, my father simply laughed it off as a case of understandable teenage nerves. Exactly 2 weeks later, a gleaming, slightly used silver sedan magically appeared in our paved driveway. The metal keys were handed over to him with a proud clap on the back and a warm smile. 4 years later, I sat nervously for my own driving exam. I passed perfectly on my very first attempt. I walked out of the government building holding my temporary paper license, feeling a sudden flicker of dangerous, stupid hope in my chest. When we arrived back home, my father gave me a brief, silent nod. He did not purchase a car for me. He did not even offer to let me practice driving with his own vehicle on the weekends. "The city bus system is incredibly convenient," he told me, walking straight past me into the bright kitchen. "It builds essential character to learn how to properly navigate public transit." My mother, Elaine Moore, was not the villain of this story. She did not actively plot my daily misery. Her distinct crime was a desperate, paralyzing addiction to domestic tranquility at any cost. She deliberately chose the comfortable illusion of peace over the sharp, uncomfortable reality of the truth every single time a conflict arose. Whenever the glaring inequalities in our house became too heavy for me to carry in silence, whenever I dared to point out the obvious fact that Owen was handed a sturdy safety net while I was handed a plastic shovel and told to dig, she would deploy her ultimate emotional defense mechanism. She would look at me with wounded, glassy eyes, place a soft, manicured hand on my tense shoulder, and deliver some slight variation of the exact same tired script. "I love you both equally. Mia," she would whisper, sounding like a recording playing on a loop. "We just try our best to provide exactly what each of you needs at the time." It was a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown directly over a raging fire. It did not actually put the fire out. It just kept the toxic smoke trapped inside the walls of the house until I was quietly choking on it in the dark. The blatant favoritism was never explosive enough to warrant a juicy neighborhood scandal. No one was physically hurting me. No one was depriving me of basic meals. But the steady erosion of my self-worth was a constant background noise. The front of our expensive stainless steel refrigerator was a dedicated monument to the glory of Owen. A moderately decent grade on a midterm history paper was proudly displayed under a heavy magnetic clip for weeks. A glossy photograph of him shaking hands with a minor local politician at a summer seminar was custom framed and placed prominently on the kitchen counter. When I brought home a perfect academic report card or a gold certificate of excellence from the highly competitive state debate tournament, my mother would smile warmly but briefly. "That is truly wonderful, sweetie," she would say, gently taking the stiff paper from my hands. "Let me just put this safely in the drawer so we can look at it later." The drawer she referred to was a dark hole located in the center kitchen island. Things went into that drawer, and they were never mentioned or seen by human eyes again. I learned incredibly early on that my hard-fought victories were merely administrative footnotes to this family, while Owen's mere participation in any event was treated as front-page news. So, I adapted to my environment. I learned exactly how to forge my own path in the dark, because standing completely still meant I was going to sink to the bottom. I spent countless agonizing hours sitting alone in the quiet school library, dialing financial aid offices across the state until my fingers cramped. I filled out dozens upon dozens of complicated scholarship forms, painstakingly writing deeply personal essays about overcoming adversity while sitting alone in my cramped, ignored bedroom. I actively secured my own part-time jobs to fund my life, working brutal retail shifts on the weekends and exhausting hours waiting tables during the hot summer months. I successfully navigated the confusing labyrinth of college class registrations and competitive corporate internship applications completely blind, with absolutely zero guidance. And the most profoundly twisted part of it all was exactly how my family chose to interpret my desperate actions. They did not see a terrified teenage girl drowning in deep water and desperately teaching herself how to swim to the shore. They looked directly at my frantic, exhausting independence and collectively decided it was just an innate quirk of my natural personality. "Look at our Mia," my father would boast loudly to his wealthy golf partners over the phone on a Sunday afternoon. "She is completely self-motivated. She never asks us for a single dime or a tiny favor." They expertly weaponized my basic survival skills to entirely absolve themselves of their absolute failure to actually parent me. I never truly hated Owen for any of this. He was not a villain actively plotting to steal my joy from the shadows. He was simply the perfect, polished product of an environment that constantly handed him the entire world on a silver platter and successfully convinced him it was his natural, undeniable birthright. When the pie is always cut by someone else, so that your specific slice is 3 times larger than the rest, you eventually stop asking if the person sitting next to you is starving. He absorbed the extra money, the larger bedroom, the endless parental grace, and the constant thundering applause because it was the only reality he ever knew. He was comfortably ignorant of the hidden, grinding mechanics that kept his own life moving forward so smoothly. But as I grew older, finally stepping out of the shadows of my childhood and into the harsh light of adulthood, the tangible, material differences between us were no longer the things that kept me awake at night. I could easily buy my own reliable car. I could comfortably pay the rent for my own apartment. I could earn my own difficult degrees through my own sweat. The true exhaustion, the bone-deep, sickening weariness that frequently made me want to scream until my lungs physically bled, was the collective, weaponized amnesia of the Moore household. It was the agonizing experience of sitting at holiday dinners year after year, listening to them casually rewrite our shared family history in real time. It was the terrifying way they all smiled brightly and acted as if the playing field had been perfectly level from the very first day. When I reached my 30s, the most exhausting part of my existence was not the undeniable fact that Owen was always the indisputable priority. The most exhausting, soul-crushing part was looking directly into the calm eyes of the people who supposedly raised me and realizing they genuinely expected me to believe I was just imagining the whole thing. The transition out of high school is supposed to be a launching pad. For me, it was a sudden, jarring halt at a dead end. While other students were packing up their belongings in matching plastic bins and buying extra long twin sheets for their dormitories, I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at a glossy community college brochure. I did not get to step directly onto a beautiful university campus like my brother did. When the time came to discuss my college tuition, the conversation was incredibly brief. My father stood by the sink, pouring a cup of black coffee, and casually mentioned that the dedicated savings account for my education was simply not quite intact as they had originally projected. He did not offer a pie chart. He did not offer an apology. He delivered the phrase with the same mild, indifferent tone one might use to announce a sudden change in the weather forecast. It was presented as an unavoidable natural disaster, an act of God that I was expected to accept without shedding a single tear. So, I went to work. I secured an entry-level position in the records department at Meridian Compliance Group. It was the kind of windowless, carpeted purgatory where ambitious dreams usually go to quietly expire. For 8 hours a day, I processed endless stacks of corporate paperwork, verifying tax identification numbers and cross-referencing dense compliance documents. I wore sensible flat shoes and cheap polyester blend trousers. I became entirely invisible to the senior partners who walked past my desk. But the moment the clock struck 5 in the afternoon, my actual labor began. I drove straight from the corporate park to the sprawling, concrete campus of the local public university. I sat in drafty lecture halls under buzzing fluorescent lights, meticulously taking notes on advanced tax law, statistical modeling, and data analytics. I lived inside that grueling, relentless cycle for 6 entire years. My 20s were not defined by spontaneous road trips, wild parties, or reckless romantic mistakes. My youth was measured out in cheap, lukewarm coffee poured from stained break-room pots. It was defined by the dull, rhythmic thumping of my old car engine, praying the worn-out tires would survive another harsh winter. I sat at my small kitchen table at 2 in the morning, rubbing my burning eyes, while my coworkers were deep asleep and my former high school friends were busy mailing out their expensive gold-foiled wedding invitations. I existed in a state of permanent, bone-deep exhaustion. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, silently watching everyone else move forward while I was chained to my textbooks and my monthly utility bills. There was exactly one moment when I almost surrendered. It was the second week of December, right in the middle of my final exams for my junior year. The temperature had dropped below freezing. I turned the key in my ignition after a brutal closing shift at the office, and the engine gave a pathetic, dying click. The alternator was completely dead. I sat freezing in the dark parking lot, staring at my phone. My checking account was entirely empty. My single credit card was resting exactly $20 below its maximum limit. I rested my forehead against the freezing steering wheel and let the darkness wash over me. I wanted to call my father. I wanted to beg him for help, but I knew exactly what his voice would sound like. I knew the heavy, burdened sigh he would let out before lecturing me on personal financial responsibility. I did not make the call. I walked 3 miles in the freezing wind to catch the last city bus. I passed my statistics final the next morning on 2 hours of sleep. I realized then that my degree was never going to be a beautifully wrapped gift. It was a heavy, iron door, and I was going to have to tear it off its hinges with my own bare and bleeding hands. When the day finally arrived to collect that piece of paper, I was too physically exhausted to feel triumphant. My family did actually attend the commencement ceremony, but my celebration was treated like a minor logistical inconvenience squeezed tightly into their busy weekend itinerary. My graduation lunch was perfectly sandwiched between my father's strictly scheduled afternoon golf tea time and a crucial meeting to view a potential venue for my brother's upcoming corporate networking event. We went to a loud, casual Italian chain restaurant situated right next to the shopping mall. The waiters wore ridiculous suspenders. The tables were covered in cheap paper tablecloths. There were no emotional toasts. There were no grand speeches about my future or the immense sacrifices I had made to reach that specific day. We ordered quickly because my father kept checking the time on his phone, before the basket of warm garlic bread even arrived at our table. Daniel leaned over and casually slid a thin white envelope across the paper tablecloth. He did not look me in the eyes. "I am very happy for you. Mia," he said quickly, his voice flat and completely devoid of any real depth. I opened the card. It was a generic, pre-printed, congratulatory message. Tucked inside were 3 crisp $50 bills. $150. That was the exact calculated value of 6 years of sleep deprivation, freezing bus rides, and suffocating corporate grind. Before I could even mutter a polite thank you, he immediately shifted his body weight toward Owen. "So," he said, leaning in with genuine enthusiasm, "tell me more about the seating arrangements for your master's degree project presentation next week." My achievement was officially acknowledged, paid for, and swiftly dismissed in under 2 minutes. For a long time, I actively forced myself to be the bigger person. I engaged in a grueling psychological routine to justify their behavior. I told myself that I was simply more mature, far more practical, and completely self-sufficient. I convinced myself that I did not need the loud, performative affection they showered on my brother. I turned my silent pain into a twisted kind of moral exercise. Every time I felt the sharp sting of being completely ignored, I wrapped it up in a neat little box of personal stoicism. "I am the strong one," I would whisper to myself in the dark. "I am the one who survives." It was a desperate survival mechanism, a way to keep my heart functioning without having to look directly at the agonizing reality of my own insignificance. But the more I tried to rationalize the gaping divide between us, the more I began to notice a truly terrifying detail. It was hidden entirely in their vocabulary. When my parents spoke about Owen, their words were constantly bathed in golden, brilliant light. He was always described as incredibly ambitious, remarkably special, and destined for greatness. He was meant for more. But when they spoke about me, their language instantly shrank. Their words became incredibly economical, stripped of any warmth or grand vision. To them, I was simply solid. I was deeply reliable. I was easy. They used the exact same adjectives to describe me that one might use to describe a moderately priced washing machine or a sturdy pair of work boots. I was functional. I was low maintenance. I existed solely to run quietly in the background without causing them any disruption or demanding any expensive maintenance. The extravagant dinner at Marlowe House with the gleaming luxury watch did not suddenly forge a brand new wound in my chest. It did not create a new pain. What it did was infinitely more devastating. The blinding flash of the cameras and the golden glow of the Rolex simply illuminated the dark, empty space where my own worth should have been. It acted as a blinding spotlight, shining directly on the brutal, indisputable price tag of the degree I had purchased with the best years of my youth. My brother was freely given the entire world, wrapped in dark green velvet and unconditional adoration. I was given a cheap paper tablecloth, $150, and the silent, crushing expectation that I would simply disappear into the background and take care of myself. I did not wake up the morning after the Marlowe House dinner and draft a furious, sweeping manifesto. I did not send a long, emotionally charged text message to our family group chat outlining every single grievance I had accumulated over the past 3 decades. I did not post cryptic, passive-aggressive quotes on social media for my extended relatives and former high school classmates to dissect. I did something entirely different. I simply evaporated. I completely stopped arriving at the places where my family had always blindly assumed I would be. Thanksgiving arrived on the 4th Thursday of November. It was an annual event usually marked by dry roasted turkey, heavy crystal wine glasses, and my mother's frantic attempts to keep the conversation floating pleasantly on the surface. When the group text inevitably chimed on Tuesday morning asking what exact time I would be arriving to help set the formal dining table, I did not invent a sudden illness. I did not claim my car broke down. I typed 5 simple words. I am busy this year. I did not offer an alternative date to celebrate. I did not soften the blow with a warm closing statement. I hit send and placed my phone face down on my cold kitchen counter. Christmas followed exactly 1 month later. Then came my parents' 35th wedding anniversary in early spring. Every single time the obligatory invitation appeared on my glowing screen, my response remained exactly the same cold, impenetrable wall. I am busy. I hope everyone has a good time. The silence that stretched between my apartment and the Charlotte suburbs was not absolute, but it was hollow. My mother, Elaine, entirely refused to acknowledge the sudden, gaping void at her table. Instead, she doubled down on her highly practiced routine of superficial intimacy. She sent me poorly lit photographs of a new pot roast recipe she was attempting in her expensive slow cooker. She asked if my apartment heater was working properly because the local evening news had predicted a severe frost warning for the weekend. She typed long, rambling paragraphs detailing the minor, irrelevant drama regarding the neighbors across the street and their overgrown oak tree branches. She reached out at least 3 times a week, desperately maintaining the fragile illusion of a connected, loving mother and daughter, but she actively, fiercely avoided asking the single, glaring question that actually mattered. She never once asked why I was not there. To ask the question would require her to brace herself for the honest answer, and Elaine Moore was entirely allergic to uncomfortable truths. She preferred the quiet hum of a broken relationship over the loud crash of a real confrontation. My father's communication strategy was even more detached. Daniel Moore operated under the strict, unwavering belief that any emotional rift could be easily smoothed over with casual masculine indifference and a hot meal. He only texted me 2 distinct types of messages. The first was generic regional sports updates, usually complaining about the terrible defensive line of the local professional football team or the poor coaching decisions in a college basketball game. The second was the occasional Sunday afternoon text that read, "Your mother made that baked chicken casserole you like so much. Drop by later if you have some free time." He typed those specific words as if a fundamental, lifelong rupture in our family dynamic could be magically repaired with a serving of lukewarm casserole placed in a cheap plastic container. He flatly refused to chase me. He merely left the back door unlocked, fully expecting the stray dog to eventually wander back into the kitchen when it got hungry enough. Owen did not notice my absence immediately. It took him nearly 3 full months to realize the dependable background noise of his life had gone quiet. When he finally dialed my number on a Tuesday evening, it was the first time my brother had initiated a phone call to me in almost 4 years. His voice over the cellular connection was hesitant, laced with a strange, unfamiliar awkwardness. I could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of upbeat music in the background, likely from his local gym. "Hey," he started, clearing his throat loudly. "So, I was just wondering, did something weird happen at my graduation dinner?" I sat on my sofa and stared at the blank television screen across my living room. I listened to his steady breathing through the small speaker. He genuinely had no idea. He was not being purposefully malicious or cruel. He was simply completely blind to the reality of anyone else's experience. That single, fumbling question cemented my decision to stay away. It made me realize with sharp clarity that the entire family viewed my sudden departure as a temporary technical glitch. They thought I was experiencing a minor mood swing, a fleeting moment of irrational sensitivity. None of them possessed the emotional capacity to recognize my absence as the catastrophic collapse of a thoroughly broken system. During those quiet winter months, I decided to declutter my small apartment. I pulled down several dusty cardboard boxes from the top shelf of my bedroom closet. Inside were heavy photo albums and cheap wooden frames I had collected since my early teenage years. As I sat cross-legged on the faded living room rug, carefully wrapping each picture in old newspaper, a profound and heavy realization washed over me. I looked at a photograph from a summer camping trip when I was 14 years old. I looked at a faded picture taken at a local park after a regional debate tournament where I had won a silver medal. I sorted through dozens of captured moments, and the truth stared back at me in glossy color. The vast majority of my absolute best memories, the rare moments where I actually felt a genuine sense of peace or personal accomplishment, did not feature my father standing in the center of the frame. In fact, He was rarely in the frame at all. He was always off to the side, checking his digital pager, taking an urgent business phone call, or walking away toward the paved parking lot. I was carefully packing away a documented history that proved I had essentially raised myself. There was exactly one person in the entire extended Moore bloodline who flatly refused to participate in the collective theatrical production of pretending everything was perfectly fine. Aunt Judith was my father's younger sister, but she shared absolutely none of his suffocating need for appearances or social standing. Late one evening, my phone vibrated loudly against the wooden coffee table. The screen lit up with a single, unprompted text message from her. It did not contain polite pleasantries. It did not ask about the changing weather. It read, "You were absolutely right to leave them. They will only understand the value of your presence when they are forced to stare at an empty chair." I read the message 4 separate times. I did not reply. I did not need to. It was the absolute only piece of validation I required from my blood relatives. I did not view my newfound distance as an act of cruel, calculated punishment. I was not holding my breath and waiting in the dark for them to come crawling to my doorstep with profound, tearful apologies and grand gestures. I had simply reached a point of absolute emotional bankruptcy. For 32 years, my primary function in the Moore household was to act as a human shock absorber. I routinely contorted my own feelings, swallowed my own pride, and minimized my own basic needs to ensure that my parents and my older brother never had to feel uncomfortable about the deeply unfair way they treated me. My silence was not a sharp weapon forged to hurt them. My silence was a heavy iron shield. It was the first time in my entire existence that I officially stopped managing other people's guilt. I stopped making it incredibly easy for them to take me for granted. As the invisible wall between my small city apartment and my childhood suburban home grew taller and thicker with each passing week, the massive amount of energy I used to waste on maintaining a fake family bond was suddenly freed. I had extra hours in the day. I had mental clarity I had never experienced before. I poured all of that reclaimed energy entirely into the quiet, carpeted corridors of Meridian Compliance Group. I stopped looking nervously at my watch at 5 in the afternoon. I stopped shrinking my shoulders into the worn fabric of my gray cubicle chair during staff meetings. And exactly when my family was trying their absolute hardest to look right past my empty seat at their dining table, someone entirely outside of my bloodline finally began to look directly at me. As I pulled myself away from the people who raised me, an outsider at my firm started to see the exact potential that the Moore family had spent 3 decades training themselves to ignore. The glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Meridian Compliance Group was practically vibrating with corporate tension. We were exactly 2 hours into a grueling financial review for a mid-sized manufacturing firm. I sat near the back corner of the long, polished mahogany table, my yellow legal pad filled with meticulously organized data points. I knew exactly where the massive accounting discrepancy was hidden in their quarterly tax filings. I had known it for 30 minutes, but when I finally decided to speak, my voice was barely above a hesitant whisper. I started my sentence with the phrase, "I think maybe we should look at page 40, if that is all right with everyone." Carmen Vale, the senior partner running the entire advisory division, halted her presentation mid-sentence. She did not say a single word in front of the clients, but her sharp, dark eyes locked directly onto mine with heavy intention. When the exhausting session finally concluded and the gray suits filed out into the carpeted hallway, she quietly told me to stay behind. She closed the heavy glass door until it clicked shut. She did not offer me a warm, maternal smile. She leaned against the edge of the wooden table, crossed her arms over her silk blouse, and delivered a clinical, devastating assessment of my entire professional existence. "You are systematically working beneath your actual capacity." "Mia," she said, her voice completely flat and devoid of any soft, comforting edges, "you always have the exact right answer. I see it buried in your weekly reports. But every single time you open your mouth in this building, you present your brilliant findings like you are offering a profound apology. You act as if you need to ask for written permission just to be the smartest person in the room." Her words echoed loudly in my head for the rest of the week. They rattled around in my skull because she had casually named the exact invisible cage my family had built around me, the very one I was still voluntarily locking myself inside every single morning. I realized then that my paralyzing fear of speaking up in corporate meetings had absolutely nothing to do with a lack of technical ability or intelligence. It was a deeply ingrained physiological response. I had spent over 3 decades being thoroughly conditioned to expect my achievements to be immediately glossed over, or worse, treated as a minor annoyance that distracted from the main event of my brother. That same month, I started weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Lena Pike. Her office was not filled with soothing ocean sounds, burning sage, or boxes of soft tissues. It was a bright, practical space on the second floor of a brick building downtown. Dr. Pike did not hold my hand and encouraged me to find a peaceful path to forgiving my family. We did not waste a single hour talking about grace or turning the other cheek. Instead, she asked me to look directly at the brutal, undeniable architecture of my own behavior. She forced me to map out the exact pattern of my survival mechanism. We traced the dark lines of how I constantly shrank my physical presence, how I habitually downplayed my hard-earned victories, and how I eagerly volunteered to play the low-maintenance, easygoing role just to preserve a toxic peace for people who did not even notice I was breathing. By late autumn, Carmen Vale made her next definitive move. She did not ask if I was emotionally ready. She simply pushed me directly into the deep water. She officially transferred me out of the quiet, invisible records department and placed me squarely in the client crisis management team. It was the most volatile, high-stakes division at Meridian. The crisis floor did not pay anyone a 6-figure salary for polite silence or cautious hesitation. They only paid for ruthless accuracy and the blinding speed required to spot a catastrophic financial problem before it completely tanked a company. My very first solo assignment was a massive logistics company named Riverton Fleet Works. They were bleeding cash, and their previous auditors had spent 6 months completely failing to find the gaping wound. I spent exactly 3 days buried in their dense operational ledgers. In the middle of my second formal meeting with their executive board, I saw the exact structural loophole in their maintenance contracts. It was a massive oversight, costing them millions of dollars every quarter. The old version of myself would have waited until the meeting ended to quietly email the lead accountant with a hesitant, heavily caveated suggestion. But the heavy, suffocating weight of my childhood was slowly beginning to lift from my shoulders. I looked down at my printed spreadsheet, took a deep, steadying breath, and looked directly across the wide table at the Riverton Chief Executive Officer. I did not apologize. I did not soften my tone or shrink my posture into my chair. I pointed a steady finger at the projected screen and bluntly explained exactly how their highly paid management team and the former auditors had completely missed a compounding cost error in their regional supply chain. I braced myself for the inevitable backlash. I expected the loud, defensive anger of powerful men being corrected by a woman a decade younger than them. I waited for the heavy sigh of irritation that my father always gave me whenever I took up too much space. Instead, the chief executive officer blinked twice in total silence. Then, he leaned back in his expensive leather chair and let out a loud, booming laugh. It was not a mocking sound. It was the sound of genuine, absolute relief. "Why in the world did you not say this 48 hours ago?" he asked, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. For the very first time in my entire existence, delivering the unfiltered, razor-sharp truth did not make the people around me feel profoundly uncomfortable. It instantly earned their absolute respect. When late December finally arrived, the city streets were lined with bright festive lights and freezing winds. I did not pack a suitcase. I did not drive back to the sprawling, quiet suburbs of Charlotte. I ignored the 2 missed calls from my mother and the single, generic holiday text message from my father. Instead, I spent Christmas Eve with my best friend, Zara Knox, and her eclectic, loud group of friends in her cramped, colorful city apartment. It was not a picture-perfect, cinematic holiday dinner. The oven accidentally burned the edges of the roasted root vegetables. We drank cheap red wine out of mismatched glass tumblers. People talked over each other, laughing loudly at terrible jokes and sharing embarrassing stories from their own chaotic lives. But the air in that small room was incredibly light. Nobody was quietly keeping score of my flaws. Nobody was forcing me to perform the exhausting role of the perfectly fine, fiercely independent sister who needed absolutely nothing. I was allowed to just sit on the worn green velvet sofa and exist exactly as I was, without a single heavy expectation resting on my chest. Long after midnight, when the loud guests had finally bundled up in their heavy winter coats and walked out into the freezing snow, Zara went to the living room to fold the extra blankets. I stood completely alone in her small, dimly lit kitchen, leaning against the cold laminate counter. I listened to the quiet, rhythmic hum of her old refrigerator. I pulled a small, bound notepad and a blue pen from my leather purse. Without overthinking it, without stopping to automatically censor my own pain to protect the feelings of the people who caused it, I started writing. I wrote down the very first item. I wrote about the empty chair at my high school awards banquet. I wrote about the reliable car I never received. I wrote about the casual, cruel dismissal of my brutal work schedule. I wrote down the agonizing, decades-long list of exactly what my parents had systematically done to me under the disguise of tough love. I filled 3 entire pages with sharp, jagged letters. It was a tangible, physical inventory of my stolen worth. When I finally reached the bottom of the 3rd page, my hand was physically cramping. I placed the blue pen down on the counter next to the notepad. I looked at the dark ink bleeding slightly into the cheap paper. A profound, unshakable quiet settled directly over my heart. I knew right then, with absolute and terrifying certainty, that the heavy, invisible chains were permanently broken. I was never going to walk back into that suburban house and quietly resume my designated position in the shadows. I was never going to be their easy, invisible child ever again. Early the following year, while a thick layer of bitter winter frost still clung stubbornly to the massive glass windows of the Meridian building, Carmen called me into her pristine corner office. She did not offer me a comfortable chair. She stood squarely behind her massive oak desk and slid a heavy, unmarked white folder across the polished surface. It was an official, binding offer to move entirely out of the crisis management team and directly into the elite advisory branch of the firm. The brand new title, printed in bold black ink at the top of the crisp paper, came with a base salary that was nearly double what I had been scraping by on during my miserable years in the windowless records department. More importantly, the explicit scope of the new position completely eradicated any lingering possibility of me hiding in the safe, quiet background. I was no longer going to be the invisible, reliable engine running the corporate machine from the dark basement. I was being explicitly hired to stand at the very front of the room, look directly into the eyes of powerful people, and steer the ship. I accepted the offer before the heavy folder even came to a complete stop on her desk. I threw myself headfirst into a relentless, grueling gauntlet of incredibly difficult corporate portfolios. I ripped apart complex cost restructuring models that had baffled senior accountants for months. I designed highly aggressive operational risk assessments for massive regional distributors. The relentless, soul-crushing exhaustion that used to completely flatten my spirit back when I was working full-time and going to night school was completely gone. This brand new kind of exhaustion was electric. It was the sharp, thrilling fatigue of building a massive, undeniable structure that belonged entirely to me. Within 4 short months, the most notoriously difficult, hard-headed corporate clients at the firm officially stopped asking for the older senior male partners. They started demanding my specific name on their legal advisory contracts. The absolute true turning point arrived when I was handed the burning wreckage of a company named Holloway Transit Components. They were a massive logistical supplier, hovering precariously on the absolute brink of total financial collapse. A deeply hidden systematic internal management error was about to trigger a catastrophic default clause, threatening to instantly vaporize their absolute largest federal contract. When I flew out to their sprawling corporate headquarters, I walked into a freezing boardroom filled with 12 panicked, sweating executives. The air smelled of stale coffee and raw corporate terror. They were all desperately pointing fingers, actively burying the actual root problem under mountains of confusing financial jargon and defensive posturing. I did not sit quietly in the absolute corner and take polite, invisible notes. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table, opened my laptop, and systematically dismantled their entire fabricated narrative piece by piece. I showed them exactly where their regional supply chain was bleeding millions of dollars, but I did not stop at presenting the raw data. I looked directly across the table at the chief operations officer and the head of finance. They were two stubborn men who had been engaged in a bitter, silent, highly destructive turf war for 3 solid years. I told them bluntly, without a single softening adjective, that their personal ego battle was exactly what was bankrupting the entire company. I forced them to stop hiding behind passive-aggressive email chains and look each other dead in the eye. I flatly demanded absolute, brutal honesty before I would authorize a single step of the financial rescue plan. It was a terrifying, deeply exhilarating hour. The room was thick with defensive tension, but nobody yelled at me, nobody dismissed me. They listened carefully. For the absolute first time in my entire adult life, I was literally being paid a massive premium to not make other people feel comfortable. I was being highly compensated to make everything painfully, undeniably clear. With the significant, life-changing bump in my monthly income, I packed up my cheap, mismatched belongings and moved entirely out of my cramped, depressing living space. I signed a long-term lease on a stunning, massive 2-bedroom apartment in the vibrant South End district. It featured beautiful exposed brick walls, massive industrial windows that let in brilliant, warm afternoon sunlight, and flawless, dark hardwood floors. For the very first time since I became an adult, I did not furnish my daily life with discarded items, cheap sales, or things that were merely good enough to get by. I spent my weekend afternoons carefully selecting every single piece of furniture. I bought a deep, luxurious emerald green velvet sofa that I sank into every night. I purchased heavy, solid wood bookshelves to hold my growing collection. I hung bold, colorful, striking abstract paintings on the white walls that I genuinely loved. I was finally claiming my own physical space in the world, stretching my arms out completely and realizing I did not have to hit a suffocating wall. It was during this period of rapid, beautiful personal expansion that I attended a loud, chaotic birthday party for Zara. She had rented out the entire back patio of a popular local brewery. The evening air was perfectly warm, filled with the rich smell of roasted malt, fried food, and incredibly loud, genuine laughter. I was standing near the edge of the wooden deck, holding a freezing glass of amber ale, when I met Noah Mercer. He was an independent architect who specialized in the meticulous, painstaking restoration of historical homes. He did not approach me with loud, obnoxious confidence or heavily practiced pickup lines. He simply leaned against the sturdy wooden railing next to me, looked out at the glowing string lights, and asked me a genuine question about my advisory work. I told him a brief, slightly humorous story about a recent, highly contentious client negotiation. True to my deeply ingrained, decades-old conditioning, I instinctively finished the story by immediately downplaying my own pivotal role in the success. I said something entirely dismissive about how I just got lucky with the specific timing of the audit report. Noah took a slow, measured sip of his drink. He looked at me with calm, intensely observant brown eyes and tilted his head slightly to the side. "You know," he said, his voice quiet but incredibly clear over the loud background music, "you have this really fascinating habit. You confidently make a very large, deeply impressive statement about yourself and your capabilities, and then you immediately rush to shrink it all down so it fits perfectly inside a tiny, non-threatening box." I froze completely. My fingers tightened aggressively around my cold glass. He did not say the words to be cruel, arrogant, or condescending. He said it as a simple, highly objective observation of my internal architecture, the exact same way he would note a critical structural flaw in the stone foundation of an old Victorian house. That single, quiet observation followed me around the city for weeks. It haunted my quiet moments because it was so flawlessly, terrifyingly accurate. It came from a man I had only just met, yet it struck the exact tender nerve of the survival instinct my own family had ruthlessly bred into me for decades. They had successfully trained me to instinctively shrink the absolute truth of my own existence the very second I feared it was becoming too large, too bright, or too inconvenient for them to easily handle. Noah saw the invisible, suffocating cage in less than 5 minutes of conversation. By the middle of the sweltering summer, my career trajectory was moving at a blinding, dizzying speed. Carmen called me into her corner office again to explicitly inform me that I was tracking several months ahead of the projected corporate schedule to become a senior advisory lead. When I walked with a stack of files through the busy bullpen of the advisory floor, the junior analysts and even the much older, highly seasoned corporate partners looked at me completely differently. They no longer saw the quiet, hyper-reliable girl who used to push meaningless paper in the damp basement. They looked directly at me as a formidable, serious force, someone who was undeniably going to shape the financial future of the entire firm. I was finally, actively growing to my actual, intended size. I was building a solid, beautiful, entirely stable life constructed exclusively from my own raw materials and my own unyielding ambition. I truly thought the absolute hardest part of my long journey was firmly, permanently behind me. I genuinely believed I had successfully outrun the heavy, toxic shadows of the Moore family house. I had built an impenetrable fortress of extreme professional competence and total financial independence. But precisely when my brand new life was finally taking a permanent, beautiful, unshakable shape, my cell phone vibrated violently against the smooth surface of my marble kitchen island. The caller identification brightly displayed the name of my Aunt Judith. I answered the late evening call, fully expecting a quick, sarcastic comment about the humid southern weather or a brief, friendly check-in on my week. Instead, she delivered a piece of heavily guarded information so incredibly cold and so fundamentally devastating that it completely ripped the polished floorboards right out from under my newly built life. It was a dark, carefully buried family secret that meant my painful past was not just a tragic story of simple, passive neglect. The information she held completely changed the fundamental meaning of every single struggle I had ever endured, proving that my absolute lowest moments were directly funded by the people who were supposed to protect me. Aunt Judith did not waste time with polite introductions when I answered the phone. Her voice was uncharacteristically tight, entirely stripped of its usual dry humor. She told me she had spent the entire weekend clearing out the dusty attic of my late grandmother, Ruth Moore, hidden beneath a stack of mothballed winter coats and brittle cardboard boxes. She had found a heavy steel lockbox. Inside that box was a thick manila folder containing the original financial establishment documents for 2 separate educational trust funds. My grandmother had explicitly set them up when Owen and I were just toddlers. Seeding both accounts with an equal substantial amount of money meant entirely to guarantee our college tuitions. I stood frozen in the center of my brightly lit kitchen. For my entire adult life, I had been force-fed a very specific, carefully rehearsed narrative regarding my education. Whenever I asked why there was no money left for my state college tuition, my father would adopt a somber, burdened expression. He would confidently blame the unpredictable volatility of the financial markets. He claimed my specific fund had suffered a catastrophic depreciation during a bad economic quarter, while Owen had simply been lucky enough to withdraw his share before the market completely crashed. It was a neat, blameless story that painted my family as helpless victims of complex global economics, forcing me to accept my grueling fate as a simple stroke of terrible luck. That story was a complete, calculated fabrication. Aunt Judith sent me a rapid succession of clear, brightly lit photographs directly to my phone. I sat down heavily at my marble kitchen island, the cold stones seeping through my clothes, and I began a forensic audit of my own family history. The bank statements were printed in stark, undeniable black and white. The educational trust fund bearing my exact legal name had not slowly withered away due to poor market performance. It had been systematically, aggressively drained in a series of massive cash withdrawals. I stared intensely at the specific dates stamped next to my father-authorized signatures. The largest, most devastating withdrawal occurred exactly during the autumn of my high school senior year. It was the precise timeline when Owen had recklessly attempted to purchase a major partnership stake in a failing high-end boutique fitness center. I remembered that specific year vividly. Owen had taken out a massive, predatory personal loan to fund his arrogant business venture, firmly believing he was an undiscovered entrepreneurial genius. When the gym inevitably filed for bankruptcy a few months later, Owen was suddenly trapped beneath a crushing mountain of immediate, high-interest debt. To save his golden son from the harsh, real-world consequences of total financial ruin, Daniel Moore did not leverage his own retirement savings. He did not take out a second mortgage on their sprawling suburban home. He simply walked into a local bank branch, signed his name on a single piece of paper, and completely liquidated my entire educational future. He stole the money my grandmother had intended for me and used it to quietly erase my brother's massive failures. He called it a temporary family solution on the phone with the bank manager, a detail Judith found scribbled on a sticky note attached to the ledger. He took my future, never mentioned it to me, and never made a single attempt to repay a dime. Aunt Judith stayed on the line, her breathing heavy and ragged. She told me she had immediately confronted my mother with the explosive documents before calling me. What she revealed next turned the cold shock in my veins into a boiling, toxic rage. Elaine Moore had known. She did not know the exact dollar amounts or the complex banking logistics, but she was fully aware that my father had raided my designated safety net to rescue Owen. When Judith demanded to know how a mother could possibly justify such a profound, unforgivable betrayal, my mother had wept and repeated the exact same toxic rationalization that had defined my entire existence. Daniel told me it was just a temporary fix. My mother had sobbed to Judith. He said Mia was so much stronger than Owen. He said Mia was incredibly resilient, and she would eventually find her own way, but Owen desperately needed us to save him right then. They did not steal from me because they thought I was weak. They stole from me precisely because they knew I was strong enough to survive the theft. They weaponized my natural resilience, turning my ability to endure hardship into a completely justified reason to actively inflict hardship upon me. I hung up the phone with Judith and walked slowly into my home office. I opened my heavy metal filing cabinet and pulled out the thick, depressing folder containing my own historical financial records. I laid my old student loan agreements, my past due credit card statements from my early 20s, and my ancient dog-eared college tuition bills side by side on my desk. I cross-referenced those painful, desperate documents with the glowing photographs of the bank withdrawals on my phone. It was a terrifying, deeply sickening emotional audit. I tracked the exact month my father withdrew $25,000 from my trust fund to settle a legal threat against Owen. That was the exact same month I was forced to take on a third weekend shift at a local diner just to afford my used accounting textbooks, sleeping a maximum of 4 hours a night. I looked at another withdrawal for $15,000, used to cover Owen rent when he refused to take a lower-paying job. That transaction was dated the exact same week my old car broke down in the freezing rain, leaving me sobbing in a dark parking lot because I could not afford a $60 towing fee. The crushing, bone-deep exhaustion of my 20s was not a noble, unavoidable struggle against difficult circumstances. It was not a testament to my gritty independence. It was a direct, calculated consequence of my parents deciding exactly who deserved to be protected and who deserved to be sacrificed. Every single hour I spent shivering at a dark bus stop, every cup of cheap coffee I drank to stay awake during night classes, every moment of sheer panic when my bank account reached zero, all of it was entirely funded by my father's quiet decision to hand my safety over to my brother. 2 days later, my phone rang again. It was Owen. This was his second attempt at contact since I had disappeared from their lives, and his voice lacked the breezy, arrogant ignorance of his first call. The tone was tight, nervous, and entirely stripped of its usual bulletproof confidence. He had spoken to our mother. He knew that I knew. I did not yell. I did not hurl insults through the speaker. I simply asked him one incredibly clear question. Did you know where the money came from when the gym collapsed? He was silent for a very long time. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked slightly. No, he said, sounding genuinely small for the first time in his life. I swear to you, Mia, I never saw the actual accounts. I never asked to look at the paperwork. I just knew that whenever I messed up, whenever I fell behind, our parents would find some magical source of funding to fix it. I just assumed it was their own money. I never asked where the materials came from. I listened to his shallow breathing and realized a profound, complicated truth. Owen was not the evil architect of this deeply corrupt family structure. He did not actively plot to steal my future. But he had lived so incredibly comfortably inside that luxurious, custom-built house for his entire life that he never once bothered to look down and ask whose bones were crushed into the foundation. He was entirely complicit through his chosen, blissful ignorance. He eagerly accepted the endless bailouts, the larger bedrooms, the expensive cars, and the constant applause without ever questioning the massive, invisible cost because the cost was never his to pay. I ended the call without offering him a single word of absolution. I walked back to my desk and slowly closed the heavy manila folder containing my old bills. The towering, complex mystery of my entire childhood was finally solved, reduced to a few stark pages of banking history. The image of the graduation dinner at Marlowe House flashed brilliantly in my mind. I saw the dark green velvet box sitting on the white linen tablecloth. I saw the blinding flashes of the cameras. I saw the heavy steel and gold of the luxury watch gleaming under the restaurant lights. I finally understood that the expensive timepiece was never merely a generous congratulatory gift for a newly acquired master's degree. It was not just a symbol of my brother's supposed corporate potential. That watch was the ultimate physical manifestation of my family's entire moral philosophy. It was constructed from cold steel, scratch-resistant sapphire crystal, and the deliberate, unforgivable choice to repeatedly sacrifice one child to ensure the total comfort of the other. They had literally taken the very money that was meant to secure my future, used it to pave a perfectly smooth road for Owen, and then used whatever they had left over to buy him a shining trophy to celebrate how far he had walked. The Rolex was not a slap in the face, it was a detailed confession, and I now held every single receipt required to bring the entire corrupt enterprise crashing down straight onto their heads. A few months later, the suffocating heat of late summer transitioned into the crisp, sharp winds of autumn. At Meridian, I was handed the absolute most terrifying portfolio of my entire career. A massive telecommunications conglomerate, our firm's absolute largest and most lucrative account, was locked in a devastating financial death spiral over a completely botched regional merger. If the deal collapsed, Meridian would lose a strategic, long-term contract worth millions of dollars. I took over the advisory lead position without a single moment of hesitation. I did not sleep for 3 straight days. I aggressively tore apart their operational risk models, located the glaring toxic assets deeply hidden in their subsidiary ledgers, and presented a brutal, razor-thin restructuring plan that successfully saved the entire acquisition from total ruin. My name echoed rapidly through the high-rise elevator banks and the executive corner offices of our corporate headquarters. I was no longer just a rising talent. I was the absolute standard. By early November, the regional business landscape formally took notice of my existence. Piedmont Business Review, a highly respected, glossy magazine that sat on the expensive coffee tables of every wealthy executive and country club lobby in the state, published a featured profile on the rising stars of corporate risk advisory. I was given a full 2-page spread in the center of the issue. The professional photograph showed me standing firmly in front of the city skyline, wearing a tailored navy suit, looking sharp, unbothered, and undeniably powerful. The accompanying article detailed my rapid professional ascent, highlighting my surgical precision in executive crisis management and my absolute refusal to back down during intense corporate negotiations. I did not mail a copy of the magazine to my parents. I did not send them a link to the digital article. I did not need to do any of that because the agonizing, beautiful irony of wealthy suburban life, did all of the heavy lifting for me. According to a brief, highly amused phone call from Aunt Judith, my father found out about the extensive article while standing in the paved driveway of his next-door neighbor, a retired corporate investment banker. The neighbor enthusiastically clapped my father on the shoulder, praising my brilliant market analysis and loudly congratulating him on raising such a formidable, elite talent. For the absolute first time in his entire life, my father was forced to stand there and listen to a wealthy, influential outsider enthusiastically validate my existence. He could not dismiss me as the easy background child anymore, because the actual free market had formally declared my high value. It twisted a deep, unnameable discomfort inside his chest. He was suddenly the father of a highly successful daughter, whose success he had absolutely no hand in building, and he had to pretend to the neighborhood that he was a proud architect of my victory. While my professional stock was soaring into the upper atmosphere, the fragile, artificial economy of Owen Moore was rapidly imploding on the ground. Operating on pure arrogance and absolutely zero solid market data, my brother had decided to radically expand his boutique fitness brand, Cinder Row Performance. He aggressively leased 3 massive, highly expensive commercial spaces in premium downtown districts simultaneously. He purchased imported, top-of-the-line training equipment on heavily leveraged credit. Within 6 short months, the actual gym memberships entirely failed to meet his wildly inflated, completely unrealistic financial projections. The massive monthly overhead completely swallowed his operating capital. He was suddenly drowning in high-interest debt, his business cash flow drying up faster than water on hot pavement. True to their lifelong, deeply toxic behavioral pattern, my parents absolutely refused to let their golden son experience the natural, devastating consequences of his own profound incompetence. Without telling anyone, Daniel and Elaine had quietly taken out a massive home equity line of credit against their pristine, paid-off suburban house. They literally mortgaged the very roof over their heads to inject a desperate, massive wave of cash into Cinder Row Performance, firmly believing Owen just needed one final strong push to finally become the visionary entrepreneur he always pretended to be. It was the financial equivalent of throwing expensive fuel directly onto a raging grease fire. The corporate banks quickly realized the entire fitness business model was entirely unsustainable, and the aggressive collection notices began arriving in my parents' mailbox. As the terrifying reality of losing their actual home finally began to set in, their panicked desperation finally broke through their stubborn suburban pride. But they still could not bring themselves to treat me with basic, fundamental respect. Late on a Tuesday evening, my phone screen lit up with a long text message from my mother. It was perfectly wrapped in her usual, suffocating layer of casual denial and forced maternal warmth. The message read, "Hi, sweetheart. Hope work is going well. Your father and I are looking at some confusing bank papers for the house. If you have some free time this weekend, could you maybe take a quick look and help us sort it out?" She deliberately phrased the imminent destruction of their lifelong financial security as a minor, slightly annoying household chore. She casually expected me to offer my highly specialized, incredibly expensive professional skills as a completely free extension of my biological duty. They desperately wanted the brilliant crisis manager from the glossy business magazine to save their home, but they wanted to acquire her at the exact same discounted, invisible price they had always paid for Mia, the obedient daughter. I sat on my emerald green velvet sofa, staring at the glowing words on the screen. The old version of me would have immediately felt a heavy, sickening surge of daughterly guilt. I would have driven straight to the suburbs, spent my entire weekend painstakingly untangling their catastrophic financial mess, and handed them a perfect, customized solution while they completely ignored the massive sacrifice I had made to rescue them. I did not type a long, emotional paragraph explaining my feelings. I replied with a cold, absolute, impenetrable boundary. I told my mother I would not read a single sentence of their financial documents. I stated clearly and politely that I would not offer a single piece of professional advisory help until my father picked up the telephone, called me himself, and directly asked me the exact reason why I had walked completely away from this family 19 months ago. I hit send, placed the phone face down on the wooden coffee table, and poured myself a glass of red wine. Later that same week, while having dinner with Noah and Zara at a small, dimly lit corner bistro, I told them about the text message exchange. Zara smiled widely over her wine glass, her dark eyes shining with fierce, protective pride. Noah reached across the small wooden table and briefly covered my hand with his own. He noted quietly that this was the absolute turning point of my entire journey. For my entire life, I had desperately used my academic achievements, my professional milestones, and my relentless hard work as a desperate currency to buy just a tiny fraction of love and recognition from the people who completely refused to give it to me freely. Now, I was officially holding all of the most powerful cards at the table, and I was flatly refusing to play their rigged game. I was no longer willing to trade my immense value for their meager scraps of conditional attention. The heavy silence from the suburbs stretched out for 4 agonizing, tension-filled days. I knew exactly what was happening inside the walls of that house. Daniel Moore was pacing the dark hardwood floors, staring at the terrifying bank foreclosure notices, fighting a brutal, exhausting war against his own massive ego. He had to finally swallow the bitter, undeniable reality that I was no longer the compliant, desperate child waiting patiently in the shadows to be summoned at his convenience. I was the absolute only person fully capable of stopping the massive financial bleeding, and I had firmly locked the vault door. He had to realize that in order to get the professional savior he desperately needed, he first had to face the daughter he had systematically broken and robbed. When my cell phone finally rang at 8 o'clock on Thursday night, and my father's name flashed brightly across the glass screen, I felt my pulse steady. I knew he was not just calling to ask for a simple favor. He was finally bringing a massive, decades-old moral debt directly to the table, and the final collection date had officially arrived. The glowing screen of my cell phone illuminated the dark living room on a quiet Thursday evening. I was sitting on my emerald green sofa, a thick corporate prospectus resting on my lap, when the device vibrated against the wooden coffee table. The caller identification displayed my father name in stark white letters. It had been exactly 19 months since I walked out of that brightly lit restaurant parking lot, leaving the heavy, unspoken burdens of my childhood behind me. 19 months of complete physical and emotional absence, reduced to a sudden, digital ringing in my quiet sanctuary. I let it ring 4 separate times, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of my own heartbeat, before I finally reached out and swerved my thumb across the glass screen to answer. My father opened the conversation with a tone so casually normal, it was almost entirely absurd. He did not sound like a man calling his estranged daughter after a year and a half of profound silence. He sounded like a man checking in after a brief weekend away. He asked about the changing autumn weather in the city. He asked if my new apartment was getting proper heating. He asked if the senior partners at Meridian were treating me with appropriate respect. He delivered these mundane, polite questions with a forced, breezy rhythm, acting as if the gaping 19-month void between us was nothing more than a minor dropped signal on a cellular network. I listened to him speak. I did not interrupt, but more importantly, I did not offer him the familiar, comforting rescue I had always provided in the past. For my entire life, my designated role was to smooth over his awkwardness, to fill the heavy silences with cheerful compliance, and to make sure he never felt the sharp sting of his own emotional failures. Not tonight. When he finished a rambling sentence about the local sports team, I offered absolutely nothing in return. I let the dead air stretch across the connection. I allowed the heavy, uncomfortable silence to sit squarely on his shoulders. I listened to his shallow breathing, hearing the slight, frantic hesitation creeping into the back of his throat as he slowly realized that the easy, accommodating girl he used to know was completely gone. Eventually, the agonizing silence broke his composure. He cleared his throat, a harsh, dry sound, and shifted his approach. He lowered his voice, adopting the serious, burdened tone he always used when discussing adult problems he expected me to quietly absorb. He said the family was currently navigating a few complex financial matters. The sheer audacity of that specific phrase was breathtaking. Hearing him refer to the systemic theft of my educational trust fund and the catastrophic collapse of my brother-leveraged business as a complex financial matter made my entire life stand up inside my chest. It was the ultimate, sterile corporate euphemism designed to mask a deeply personal betrayal. I did not let him finish the thought. I cut him off. My voice was incredibly quiet, completely devoid of anger, but forged from absolute, unbreakable iron. I told him that if he wanted to speak to me about money, bank files, or Owen, he had to stop right there. I informed him that before we could discuss a single spreadsheet or a single mortgage document, he had to finally ask the real question. He had to ask out loud exactly why I had not returned home for 19 months. The silence that followed my demand was immense and profound. It felt like standing at the edge of a massive canyon, waiting for the echo of a dropped stone. I could practically hear the desperate gears turning in his head, fighting the lifelong instinct to deflect, to change the subject, to order the decaffeinated coffee and move on, but he had absolutely nowhere left to run. He needed the professional auditor, and the toll to access her was the absolute truth. Finally, his voice came back through the small speaker. It was stripped of all its executive bravado, sounding remarkably fragile and incredibly old. He asked, slowly and carefully, if he had done something that he was completely refusing to see. It was the closest he had ever come to genuine accountability in his entire existence, but I was not going to give him the swift, easy absolution of a quick phone conversation. I told him I would not answer that question while sitting alone in my apartment. I instructed him to meet me on Saturday evening at 8 o'clock. I chose a specific, highly exclusive restaurant downtown. It was an establishment known for its thick velvet booths, heavily muted acoustics, and deep, private corners. It was a place explicitly designed so that no one could hide their emotional reactions behind the loud clatter of silverware, the distraction of a busy waiter, or the scattered conversations of neighboring tables. He agreed immediately, his voice tight with an anxiety I had never heard him possess. During the 2 days I spent waiting for the Saturday meeting, I did not pace my hardwood floors. I did not stand in front of my bathroom mirror drafting a loud, theatrical revenge speech. I approached the impending dinner with the cold, precise mentality of a senior corporate investigator. I prepared a mental map of the absolute truth. I organized the chronological data of my emotional bankruptcy. I cataloged the grueling bus rides, the frozen car engine, the generic graduation card, the hurried lunch, the dark green velvet box, the gleaming steel watch, the sudden pivot to the dessert menu, the stolen inheritance from my grandmother, and the ultimate toxic mantra that I was simply stronger and could handle being pushed aside. I did not need a script because the receipts were permanently burned into my memory. I also established a strict, impenetrable quarantine around the upcoming meeting. I called my mother on Friday afternoon. Before she could launch into her usual routine of nervous chatter and forced optimism, I delivered a clear, unyielding directive. I told her she was absolutely forbidden from acting as a tearful mediator. I explicitly warned her not to call me and attempt to soften the blow for my father. I then sent a brief, rigid text message to Owen, instructing him to keep his phone completely turned off and to stay entirely out of the crossfire. This was a closed audit, and no external interference would be tolerated. On Saturday afternoon, a few hours before the dinner, I sat on my sofa with Noah. He poured me a cup of hot tea and watched me carefully as I checked the time on my wrist. I looked at him and explained the profound shift in my own internal architecture. I told him that even if the entire evening exploded into a catastrophic argument, even if my father entirely refused to take responsibility and walked out of the restaurant, I would remain completely intact. I was not walking into that building as a wounded child desperately begging for a family to finally see her. I was walking into that room with the undeniable posture of a powerful woman who held all the leverage. I possessed the ultimate luxurious choice to simply stand up, pay the bill, and walk away forever without losing a single piece of my own immense value. When the sun finally set and the city lights began to glow against the dark sky, I took a hired car to the restaurant. The heavy glass doors opened silently. The impeccably dressed host guided me past the elegant, softly lit bar and toward a secluded booth in the very back of the dining room. My father was already there. He was sitting rigidly against the dark leather upholstery, staring blankly at the pristine white tablecloth. I looked at him closely as I approached. He was not wearing his confident, tailored boardroom suit. He was not wearing the relaxed, expensive polo shirt he wore to the country club. He was wearing a very specific, somber charcoal gray dress shirt. It was the exact same shirt he had worn to his own mother's funeral, and the exact same shirt he wore to the cardiologist office 3 years ago when he thought his heart was failing. It was his uniform for facing circumstances he knew he could not manipulate, negotiate, or control. As I slid into the booth across from him, looking directly into his tense, tired eyes, I felt the heavy electric weight of the moment settle over the table. The long, exhausting buildup was officially over. The final climax had arrived. My father did not waste a single moment. Before the waiter could even pour the sparkling water into our crystal glasses, Daniel leaned across the heavy mahogany table. He laced his fingers together and immediately tried to launch into the meticulously rehearsed details of his impending financial ruin. He started talking about the aggressive bank letters, the heavily leveraged mortgage, and the catastrophic state of my brother failing business. He spoke rapidly, desperately trying to steer the evening into the safe, comfortable territory of spreadsheets and corporate strategy where he always felt completely in control. I raised a single hand and stopped him mid-sentence. I looked directly into his tired eyes and told him that tonight we were not going to discuss a single bank loan. I told him I was not going to formulate a brilliant rescue plan to save the family home until the family finally looked directly at exactly what they had done to me. He blinked, his mouth slightly open, the executive bravado completely draining from his face. I did not give him a chance to pivot or change the subject. I took him straight back to the private dining room at Marlowe House. I painted the scene for him with agonizing precision. I reminded him of the exact moment Aunt Judith asked about my graduation. I reminded him of the tiny, dismissive nod he gave me before turning his back to flag down a waiter and ask for the dessert menu. I told him that was the precise night I finally understood the truth. He was not merely forgetful. He was not just accidentally negligent. He was simply so accustomed to never stopping his life for me that my existence had become a minor inconvenience he could easily erase with a cup of decaffeinated coffee. Daniel tried to protest, opening his mouth to utter a defensive apology, but I reached into my leather bag. I pulled out a thick stack of paper and placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of him. They were the meticulously copied bank records from Grandmother Ruth Educational Trust Fund. I spread the pages out so he was forced to look at his own signature. Then, I placed my own brutal financial history right next to them. I pointed to the exact date he withdrew a massive sum of money to save my brother from his first failed business venture. I then pointed to a deeply depressing, high-interest student loan document I had signed just 4 days later, chaining myself to a decade of crushing debt simply to afford my basic accounting classes. I watched his eyes dart back and forth between the conflicting timelines. The chilling, undeniable overlap sat right there in the dim restaurant lighting. Every single time my brother stumbled in the bright sunshine, my father had quietly reached into the dark and stolen the very foundation out from under my feet to break his fall. I made him look at the exact cost of his favoritism. Daniel could not deny the black ink on the page. His broad shoulders completely collapsed. He looked like a man who had just watched his own reflection shatter into a million pieces. He confessed, his voice shaking and hollow. He admitted that he had systematically funneled every available resource toward Owen for decades. He looked at his hands and said he always believed Owen desperately needed more help, while he genuinely believed I would simply be fine no matter what happened. He said I was so capable that he thought I did not need the safety net. That specific phrase sucked all of the oxygen entirely out of the room. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and told him the absolute truth. I told him that assuming I would be fine was not a compliment tailored for a strong daughter. It was not a badge of honor or a testament to my character. I told him it was the exact psychological mechanism a family uses to completely justify abandoning the child who is the absolute best at enduring pain. I told him he had ruthlessly punished me for my resilience and constantly rewarded my brother for his endless incompetence. For the first time in his entire life, my father offered an apology that was not wrapped in defensive corporate jargon or polite social etiquette. He cried quietly. He admitted that he had actively weaponized my stability. He used my quiet strength as a highly convenient excuse to pour all of his emotion, all of his time, and all of my money into the louder, more demanding child. He looked up at me with wet, devastated eyes and admitted that the luxury watch at the dinner was not an isolated incident. It was simply the undeniable moment when he could no longer hide his toxic philosophy behind the illusion of equal love. We sat in heavy silence for a very long time. Eventually, he wiped his face and asked the desperate question he had come to ask. He asked if there was any professional way I could help them save the house from the massive credit default. I reached into my blazer pocket. I did not pull out a brilliant corporate rescue plan. I pulled out a single, thick business card for a highly aggressive, independent financial restructuring firm located on the other side of the city. I slid it across the table. I told him they were incredibly expensive, but they were the best in the business. I looked him dead in the eye and told him I was officially resigning from my lifelong position. I would no longer serve as the free, invisible cleanup crew for this family's blatant favoritism. I paid for my own glass of wine in cash, stood up, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving him sitting completely alone with the overwhelming wreckage of his own choices. The final, unexpected blow arrived much later that same evening. I was standing in my apartment, watching the city lights flicker through my large windows. When my cell phone rang, it was Owen. He did not sound arrogant. He did not sound breezy or casually ignorant. His voice was heavy and completely broken. He told me our father had just returned home and confessed everything about the trust fund and the stolen money. For the very first time in our entire shared existence, my older brother did not offer a single excuse. He did not try to justify his position or claim ignorance as an absolute defense. He simply admitted the devastating truth. He acknowledged that the vast majority of his privileged, comfortable life had been built directly on top of the times I had been ruthlessly pushed aside. He told me he was looking at the luxury watch on his wrist and feeling physically sick to his stomach. Then, he told me what he had done. He had driven straight to a high-end jewelry buyer downtown the moment he heard the truth. He had sold the watch. He informed me that he had just transferred the entire sum of that sale, along with every single dollar he had left in his own personal savings account, directly into my bank account. He said it was only a small fraction of what they had stolen from me, but it was the first installment of his lifelong repayment. I checked my phone and saw the massive electronic transfer pending in my account. I accepted the money because it rightfully belonged to me, but I did not use it as a bridge to return to the suburbs. I did not agree to attend a tearful reconciliation dinner. I did not step back into the suffocating role of the good, forgiving daughter to make them feel better about their decades of cruelty. I stood in my quiet, beautiful home, completely surrounded by the life I had built with my own two hands. I looked out at the sprawling city below me. I realized then that the most beautiful, satisfying revenge in the entire world does not involve screaming, or destroying their lives, or making them bleed the way they made me bleed. True revenge is completely walking away. It is forcing them to live the rest of their lives with the heavy, undeniable truth that when they finally realized my worth, when they finally came desperately looking for me, I had grown so tall and so strong that I simply no longer needed them to choose me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment telling me where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the Maya Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.